Thursday evening arrived with an unexpected nervousness that reminded Sarah of her first day of college. She had changed clothes 3 times, finally, settling on a comfortable sweater that didn't feel too much like armor. The walk to the student center gave her time to question her decision. But David's words kept echoing in her mind. That's what we do for each other. The conference room was smaller than she had imagined, with chairs arranged in a casual circle rather than the formal rows she was used to in classrooms. When she arrived, 5 people were already there, including David, who smiled warmly and gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Everyone, this is Sarah, the nursing student I mentioned," David said as she sat down. "Sarah, let me introduce you to our group." The introductions revealed stories that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Maria, a young woman about Sarah's age, had lost both legs in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. James, a soft-spoken man in his 40s, was dealing with PTSD from his service in Iraq. Linda, who appeared to be in her 50s, was a breast cancer survivor who had returned to school to become a social worker. Tom, barely 20, had been born with a spinal condition that required him to use a wheelchair. "We meet every Thursday to check in, share challenges, and celebrate victories," explained Linda, who seemed to serve as the group's informal coordinator. "No pressure to share more than you're comfortable with. But we found that talking through things with people who understand makes a real difference." As the conversation flowed, Sarah found herself amazed by the resilience and humor of the group members. They spoke openly about their struggles with accessibility, dealing with public reactions, and the internal work of rebuilding confidence. But they also shared jokes, academic achievements, and plans for the future. "Sarah, David mentioned you're in the nursing program," Maria said. "That's fantastic. What made you choose that field?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided on honesty. "I spent a lot of time in hospitals after my accident. The nurses were the ones who saw me through the worst days, not just medically but emotionally. They treated me like a person, not just a case study. I want to do that for other people." "That's exactly the kind of motivation that makes great healthcare providers," said James. "You understand what it's like to be vulnerable." The group spent the next hour sharing practical advice about everything from dealing with stares to advocating for themselves in academic settings. Sarah learned about disability services she hadn't known existed and heard strategies for handling difficult social situations that she had been navigating alone. "Has anyone dealt with other students being deliberately cruel?" Sarah asked, thinking of Jessica's behavior. "Oh, absolutely," said Tom. "Some people seem to think that having a visible difference gives them license to comment or stare. I've had people ask the most inappropriate questions." "What do you do about it?" Sarah asked. "Depends on the situation," Maria replied. "Sometimes I educate, sometimes I ignore, and sometimes I shut it down hard. You have to pick your battles." "David mentioned you had a situation in anatomy class," Linda said gently. Sarah found herself telling the group about Jessica's comments and behavior, and how David had intervened. The group listened without judgment, offering both sympathy and practical advice. "You know what I learned from situations like that?" Linda said when Sarah finished. "People like Jessica are usually operating from fear and ignorance. They mock what they don't understand because it makes them feel safer from their own vulnerability. That doesn't make it okay," Maria added firmly. "But understanding the psychology can help you not take it personally." "The bigger issue," said James, "is that you shouldn't have to handle this alone. Having allies makes all the difference." As the evening wound down, Sarah realized she felt lighter than she had in months. The weight of carrying her experiences alone had been lifted, replaced by the knowledge that she was part of a community that understood. David walked with her toward the parking lot after the meeting ended. "How was that?" he asked. "Better than I expected," Sarah admitted. "I had forgotten what it felt like to be around people who don't see me as damaged first." "You're not damaged," David said firmly. "You're rebuilt. There's a difference. Sometimes rebuilt is stronger than the original." The following weeks brought gradual but noticeable changes in Sarah's college experience. Armed with strategies from the support group and the confidence that came from no longer feeling alone, she began participating more actively in class discussions. Her knowledge and insights, particularly about patient care and medical procedures, earned respect from both classmates and professors. Jessica's behavior had shifted as well. The public confrontation with David seemed to have served as a wake-up call. While she wasn't exactly friendly toward Sarah, she had stopped making cruel comments and appeared to be making an effort to be more considerate in her interactions with all her classmates. The real test came during their final anatomy practical before spring break. Students were required to work in pairs, and Professor Williams assigned partnerships based on academic performance. To Sarah's surprise, she found herself paired with Jessica. "Look," Jessica said quietly as they approached their first station. "I know I was really awful to you before." David was right. I was being cruel, and I'm sorry. Sarah looked at Jessica carefully, searching for signs of insincerity but finding none. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "I don't really understand what you went through," Jessica continued. "But I know it must have been horrible, and you didn't deserve me making it worse." They worked through the practical and professional cooperation, if not friendship. Sarah noticed that Jessica seemed genuinely interested in learning from her expertise, asking thoughtful questions about anatomy and medical procedures. "You really know this stuff," Jessica said as they finished identifying structures at the cardiovascular station. "I can see why you want to be a nurse. You'd be good at it." It wasn't a profound moment of transformation, but it was progress. Sarah realized that sometimes the biggest victories were small ones, like earning basic respect and human decency from someone who had previously treated her as less than human. After the practical, Sarah met David and several other group members at the campus coffee shop to celebrate the end of midterms. As she sat with her new friends, laughing at Tom's story about a professor who had awkwardly tried to help him reach something he could reach perfectly well himself, Sarah reflected on how much had changed. "You look happy," David observed during a lull in the conversation. "I feel happy," Sarah realized. "For the first time since the fire, I feel like I belong somewhere." "You always belonged somewhere," Maria said, overhearing. "You just needed to find the right somewhere." Later that evening, Sarah called her mother for their weekly check-in. She found herself sharing stories about school, her friends, and her growing confidence in her chosen career path. "You sound different, sweetheart," her mother said. "Stronger, somehow." "I feel stronger," Sarah replied. "I think I'm finally learning the difference between hiding from the world and protecting myself while I heal." "What's the difference?" Sarah considered the question. "When you hide, you give up parts of yourself to avoid judgment. When you protect yourself while healing, you choose who gets to see the real you. But you don't pretend the real you doesn't exist." "That's very wise," her mother said softly. "I'm proud of the woman you're becoming." After hanging up, Sarah looked at herself in the mirror. The scars were still there, still visible when she chose to let them be seen. But they no longer felt like shameful secrets. They were part of her story, proof of what she had survived and overcome. She thought about David's words from that first day. "Sometimes rebuilt is stronger than the original." She was beginning to understand what he meant. The fire had taken things from her: skin, confidence, her sense of invulnerability. But the rebuilding process had given her things too: empathy, resilience, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. As the semester continued, Sarah's reputation grew among her professors and classmates. She was elected to represent her class on the nursing program's Student Advisory Committee. Her insights about patient experience and her dedication to her studies made her a natural leader. The support group continued to be a cornerstone of her week, but she found that she was now offering as much support as she received. New members joined throughout the semester, and Sarah discovered that sharing her own journey helped others navigate theirs. On the final day of anatomy class, Professor Williams made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I want to recognize a student who has consistently demonstrated not just academic excellence, but the kind of character and dedication that will make her an outstanding healthcare provider," he said. "Sarah Martinez has shown us all what it means to transform personal experience into professional strength." The applause that followed was genuine and warm. Even Jessica clapped, offering Sarah a small but sincere smile. After class, several students approached Sarah to congratulate her and ask about her plans for the nursing program. For someone who had started the semester hoping to remain invisible, she found herself at the center of positive attention. "Hey," David said, catching up with her as she left the building. "Dinner to celebrate? The whole group is going to that new place downtown." "I'd love that," Sarah replied, and meant it. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the building's glass doors. She was wearing a short-sleeved shirt, something she hadn't done in public since before the fire. The decision had been spontaneous that morning, driven by the warm spring weather and a growing sense that she no longer needed to hide. Her scars were visible, but so was her smile. So was the confidence in her posture and the peace in her expression. She looked like someone who had been through hell and come out stronger for it. "You know what I realized?" she told David as they reached his car. "What's that?" Jessica was right about one thing. I was hiding, but not from judgment about my scars. I was hiding from the possibility that people might see me as just another survivor instead of the person I'm becoming. David nodded thoughtfully. And now I realize that being a survivor isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning of a much better chapter. As they drove toward dinner with friends who understood both her struggles and her strength, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude. The fire had taken much from her, but it had also led her to this moment, surrounded by people who valued her not despite her experiences, but because of how those experiences had shaped her into someone worth knowing. She was no longer the girl with the hidden scars. She was Sarah Martinez, nursing student, survivor, friend, and someone who had learned that the most beautiful rebuilds often came from the most devastating damages. And that was a story worth sharing. The next morning brought an unexpected chill to the campus, and Sarah was grateful for the excuse to wear her heaviest sweater. She arrived early to anatomy class, hoping to avoid the pre-class socializing that had become increasingly uncomfortable. As she settled into her usual back corner seat, she noticed a new face in the classroom. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, older than the typical college student. He had short, military-style hair and moved with the precise, economical motions of someone accustomed to discipline. What caught Sarah's attention immediately was the way he walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, and the prosthetic hand that he didn't try to hide. He chose a seat in the middle of the classroom, nodding politely to nearby students, but not engaging in conversation. When he pulled out his notebook, Sarah could see the practiced way he adjusted his grip with his prosthetic, clearly someone who had long ago adapted to his circumstances. Jessica bounced into the classroom with her usual dramatic flair, immediately launching into a loud conversation about her weekend plans. She was describing some party when her gaze fell on the new student. "Oh wow, look at the new guy," she whispered to her friends, not as quietly as she thought. "Think he's some kind of veteran? Look at that fake hand." Sarah cringed at Jessica's tactless observation. The new student, whose name she learned was David Chun when Professor Williams called roll, didn't seem to notice or simply chose to ignore the whispered comments. During the lecture on the nervous system, David took meticulous notes and asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of anatomy. Professor Williams seemed pleased to have such an engaged student and encouraged his participation. "Mr. Chun raises an excellent point about nerve regeneration," the professor said. "The peripheral nervous system does have remarkable healing capabilities, though the process is complex and often incomplete." Sarah found herself impressed by David's knowledge and his calm, professional demeanor. There was something about his presence that commanded respect without demanding it. After class, Sarah was gathering her materials when she overheard Jessica's group clustered near the door. "I wonder what happened to him," Jessica was saying, staring at David as he packed his bag. "Probably Afghanistan or something. At least his injuries are obvious. Some people try to hide their problems and make everyone else uncomfortable." The pointed look Jessica threw in Sarah's direction made her meaning crystal clear. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she kept her head down and continued packing. "That's a pretty messed up thing to say," Marcus interjected, but Jessica just shrugged. "I'm just being honest. Some people handle their situations better than others," Jessica replied, her voice carrying clearly across the room. David had been walking toward the door, but stopped when he heard Jessica's comment. He turned slowly, his expression calm but his eyes sharp as they assessed the situation. Sarah saw him notice her, then shift his gaze to Jessica and her group. "Excuse me," David said, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Jessica looked startled but quickly recovered, putting on her brightest smile. "Oh, hi. You're the new student, right?" "I'm Jessica." "David," he replied without returning the smile. "I was wondering if you could clarify something for me. You mentioned that some people handle their situations better than others. What exactly did you mean by that?" Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I just meant, some people are more open about things. Like, they don't make everyone else feel weird by trying to hide stuff." "I see," David said, his tone remaining perfectly level. "And you feel qualified to judge how others should handle their personal challenges?" The classroom had grown quiet, other students sensing the tension. Sarah watched from her seat, unsure whether to slip away or stay. "I'm not judging anyone," Jessica said defensively. "I'm just saying that honesty is better than making people guess what's wrong with you." David nodded slowly. "That's interesting. Tell me, when you see my prosthetic hand, what do you think about?" Jessica looked confused by the question. I don't know. I guess I wonder what happened." "Exactly. You see something different and immediately want an explanation. You feel entitled to know my story because my difference is visible," David continued. "Now, what if I told you that not everyone wears their struggles on the outside? What if someone had survived something traumatic, but their scars weren't immediately obvious to casual observers?" Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized David had somehow picked up on the situation. "I guess that would be different," Jessica mumbled, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Would it? Or would you still feel entitled to their story? Would you still judge how they choose to present themselves to the world?" David's questions were delivered with the patience of a teacher, but there was steel underneath. By now, the entire classroom was listening. Professor Williams had stepped out for a moment, leaving the students to navigate this unexpected confrontation. Jessica's face was flushing red. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to say, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm allowed to have opinions." "You absolutely are," David agreed. "Just as others are allowed to have opinions about the character of someone who mocks other people's trauma." The word "mocks" hung in the air like an accusation. Jessica's mouth opened and closed as she struggled for a response. "I wasn't mocking anyone," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. David reached into his backpack and pulled out a small card, which he handed to Jessica. "This has information about burn survivors and PTSD resources. I thought you might find it educational, since you seem so interested in how people handle their situations." Jessica stared at the card, her face now completely red. "How did you?" "The same way you knew she had scars," David said simply, not looking at Sarah but making it clear he had witnessed Jessica's earlier behavior. "The difference is, I recognize strength when I see it, and I don't feel the need to tear others down to make myself feel better." Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of shame. Someone understood. Someone saw her the way she wanted to be seen. Jessica looked around the room, clearly realizing that the other students were now viewing her very differently. The casual cruelty that had seemed acceptable when directed at the quiet girl in the corner looked much uglier when called out by someone who commanded respect. "This is ridiculous," Jessica said, her voice shaky. "I don't have to listen to this." "You're right. You don't," David replied calmly. "But you might want to consider that the person you've been targeting has shown more courage in a day than you've shown in your entire life." With that, Jessica grabbed her bag and stormed out of the classroom, her friends trailing behind her with awkward glances back at David and Sarah. The remaining students began filing out quietly, some casting sympathetic looks at Sarah, others appearing deep in thought about what they had witnessed. Marcus approached Sarah's desk. "Hey, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about Jessica. She was way out of line, and I should have said something sooner." "Thank you," Sarah managed, still processing what had just happened. After Marcus left, only Sarah and David remained in the classroom. Sarah wasn't sure what to say or if she should say anything at all. David approached her desk slowly, giving her time to object if she wanted to be left alone. When she didn't move away, he sat down in the chair beside her. "I hope I didn't overstep," he said quietly. "I just couldn't stand listening to someone attack a fellow survivor." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Survivor?" David nodded. "IED in Kandahar, 3 years ago. Lost my hand and did some damage to my leg. Spent a long time in recovery wondering if people would ever see me as anything other than broken." "I was in a house fire," Sarah said softly. 3 years ago. burns on my arms and torso. I figured it was something like that. The way you carry yourself, the way you flinch when people get too close to your arms. I recognize the protective instincts, David said. Also, Jessica wasn't exactly subtle with her comments yesterday. Sarah felt a mix of embarrassment and relief. You heard that. Hard to miss. She's got the subtlety of a freight train, David said with a slight smile. Look, I know we just met, but I want you to know something. What you've been through, what you survived, that makes you stronger than most people in this room. Don't let someone who's never faced real adversity make you feel ashamed of your strength. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt herself relaxing. Here was someone who understood, who had walked a similar path and emerged with dignity intact. It's hard sometimes, she admitted. People stare, or they whisper, or they make assumptions about what I can or can't do. Tell me about it, David said, flexing his prosthetic hand. I've had people assume I can't drive, can't work with tools, can't live independently. The assumptions tell you more about their limitations than yours. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before David spoke again. You know, there's a veteran support group that meets on campus. It's not just for military vets, it's for anyone who's survived trauma and is working on rebuilding. Might be nice to be around people who understand what it's like to put yourself back together. Sarah considered the offer. She had been so focused on maintaining her privacy and avoiding pity that she hadn't considered there might be others who shared her experience. I might like that, she said cautiously. Thursday evenings, 7 p.m., in the Student Center Conference Room B, David said, standing up and gathering his materials. No pressure, but you'd be welcome. As he headed for the door, Sarah called out, David? Thank you for what you said to Jessica. No one's ever stood up for me like that before. David paused and turned back with a genuine smile. That's what we do for each other. Besides, someone needed to remind her that courage isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's just showing up every day despite what people think. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the empty classroom, feeling something she hadn't experienced since before the fire. Hope. Not just hope for her future, but hope that she might find community among people who understood that survival was just the beginning of the journey. The next few days brought a noticeable shift in the classroom dynamic. Jessica's friends seemed to distance themselves from her more caustic comments, and several students who had never spoken to Sarah before made small efforts to include her in study groups and casual conversations. Sarah found herself looking forward to Thursday evening and the possibility of connecting with others who understood the complex process of rebuilding not just a body, but a sense of self-worth. For the first time since starting college, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. Sarah Martinez adjusted her long sleeves nervously as she walked through the doors of Riverside Community College. The fabric covered the intricate web of burn scars that ran from her wrists to her elbows, permanent reminders of the house fire that had changed her life 3 years ago. At 22, she was older than most of her classmates, having spent 2 years in recovery and physical therapy before finally returning to pursue her nursing degree. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of the student center as Sarah made her way to her first anatomy class. She had chosen a seat in the back corner, hoping to blend into the background. Her textbooks were arranged neatly on her desk, each one representing a step closer to her dream of becoming a trauma nurse. She wanted to help others the way the medical team had helped her during those dark months in the burn unit. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" asked a cheerful voice beside her. Sarah looked up to see a blonde girl with perfectly manicured nails and flawless makeup smiling down at her. "No, go ahead," Sarah replied softly, scooting her bag closer to make room. "I'm Jessica," the girl said, settling into the chair with a dramatic flourish. "This is my 3rd time taking anatomy. Chemistry and biology are so not my thing. But my dad says I need to get serious about pre-med if I want him to keep paying for my car." Sarah nodded politely, but didn't offer her own name. She had learned to be cautious about getting too close to people. The stares and questions about her scars had taught her that keeping her distance was often easier than explaining her past. Professor Williams entered the classroom, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes. He began the lecture on the integumentary system, discussing skin structure and function. Sarah found herself taking detailed notes, fascinated by the complexity of the organ she had intimate knowledge of through her own healing process. The skin serves as our first line of defense, Professor Williams explained, clicking through slides showing healthy tissue. It protects us from infection, regulates temperature, and has remarkable regenerative properties. Sarah unconsciously touched her sleeve, remembering the countless skin grafts and treatments she had endured. The medical team had explained how her body was working to rebuild what the fire had taken away. Every day had been a small victory in her recovery. When the class ended, Sarah gathered her things quickly, hoping to slip out before the usual social interactions began. But Jessica was faster, grabbing her arm to get her attention. "Hey, want to grab coffee? There's this cute place across the street," Jessica said, her grip firm on Sarah's forearm. Sarah winced as Jessica's fingers pressed against a particularly sensitive area of scar tissue through the fabric. "I can't, sorry. I have work," she lied, gently pulling her arm away. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly, and Sarah saw her gaze drop to where she had touched her arm. "Okay, whatever," Jessica shrugged. But there was a calculating look in her eyes that made Sarah uncomfortable. Over the next few weeks, Sarah settled into a routine. She attended her classes, worked part-time at a local bookstore, and spent her evenings studying. She had always been academically gifted, and despite the interruption in her education, she found herself excelling in her coursework. The science came naturally to her, perhaps enhanced by her personal experience with medical procedures. It was during their third anatomy lab that the incident began. The class was studying muscle structure using cadaver specimens, and Sarah found herself paired with Jessica and two other students, Marcus and Devin. Marcus was a quiet, serious student who reminded Sarah of herself, while Devin was loud and constantly making jokes to mask his discomfort with the lab work. "This is so gross," Jessica complained, wrinkling her nose as she reluctantly approached their assigned station. "I don't know how you can stand it, Sarah. You act like you've seen this stuff before." Sarah carefully examined the specimen, pointing out the muscle groups they were supposed to identify. Her knowledge was thorough, gained not just from textbooks, but from watching her own surgeries and rehabilitation. "The deltoid connects here," she explained patiently, "and you can see how it works with the rotator cuff muscles." Devin looked impressed. "Wow, you really know this stuff. Are you planning to go pre-med too?" "Nursing," Sarah replied simply, focusing on her lab worksheet. "That's perfect for you," Jessica said with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nurses deal with all the gross stuff doctors don't want to handle." Marcus frowned at Jessica's comment, but Sarah just nodded and continued working. She was used to people underestimating nursing as a profession. What mattered to her was helping patients, not prestige. As they worked, Sarah became absorbed in the lab assignment, her sleeves riding up slightly as she manipulated the specimens. She didn't notice Jessica's sharp intake of breath or the way the girl's eyes fixed on the edge of scarring that became visible on Sarah's wrist. After class, Sarah was packing her materials when she heard Jessica's voice carrying from the hallway. "Did you see her arms?" Jessica was saying to a group of her friends. "She's got these weird marks all over them. Like, really bad ones." Sarah froze, her heart racing. She had hoped her careful clothing choices would prevent this exact situation. "Maybe it's a rash or something," suggested one of Jessica's friends. "No way. Those look like burn marks. Really bad ones," Jessica continued, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper. "I wonder what happened. Probably some kind of accident because she was being careless." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she forced herself to finish packing calmly. She had dealt with worse than gossip during her recovery. She could handle a few immature college students. But Jessica was just getting started. Over the following days, Sarah noticed the stares and whispers increasing. Jessica seemed to have spread word about Sarah's scars to half their shared classes. Students would glance at her arms, trying to catch a glimpse of what lay beneath her long sleeves. Some were merely curious, but others looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust that made her stomach turn. The breaking point came during their midterm lab practical. Students were stationed around the room, identifying structures on various specimens and models. Sarah moved through the stations efficiently, her knowledge evident in her quick, accurate answers. She was at the cardiovascular station when she heard Jessica's voice behind her. "I heard she was in some kind of fire," Jessica was telling her study group. That's why she always wears those long sleeves. Can you imagine what the rest of her looks like? That's horrible, whispered another girl. Do you think it hurts? Probably. I mean, look how she flinches when people touch her. She's like damaged goods. Jessica replied, not bothering to lower her voice much. Sarah's hand trembled as she tried to identify the structure she was examining. The words hit her like physical blows, bringing back memories of the early days after the fire when she had wondered if anyone would ever see her as whole again. I bet that's why she wants to be a nurse, Jessica continued. Like, who else would hire someone who looks like that? At least in nursing, everyone expects you to look kind of rough. Marcus, who was at the next station, turned around sharply. Jessica, that's enough, he said firmly. What? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Jessica replied with false innocence. I mean, she's nice enough, but you have to admit it's kind of gross. What if it's contagious or something? Sarah couldn't take any more. She quietly left her station and walked to the bathroom, her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall in front of the class. In the privacy of the restroom, she looked at herself in the mirror, seeing the person she had worked so hard to rebuild after the fire. The scars were part of her story, but they weren't the whole story. She had survived when doctors weren't sure she would. She had endured months of painful treatments and rehabilitation. She had fought her way back to health and independence. But, in that moment, listening to Jessica's cruel words, she felt as broken as she had in those first dark days after the accident. She took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She had come too far to let someone else's ignorance derail her dreams. She would finish this practical, complete her degree, and become the nurse she was meant to be. Jessica's words said nothing about Sarah's worth and everything about Jessica's character. When she returned to the lab, she noticed several students watching her with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Word had clearly spread beyond Jessica's immediate circle. Sarah held her head high and returned to her station, determined not to let their stares affect her performance. But the damage was done. Jessica had poisoned the well, and Sarah could feel the shift in how her classmates viewed her. She was no longer just another student. She was the girl with the scars, the object of whispered conversations and sideways glances. As she left class that day, Sarah made a decision. She would continue her education and pursue her dreams, but she would do it without expecting acceptance or friendship from her peers. She had learned to be strong on her own before, and she could do it again. What she didn't know was that someone had been listening to Jessica's cruel comments with growing anger. Someone who understood better than most what it meant to carry visible reminders of trauma, and who wouldn't stand by while a fellow survivor was torn down by someone who had never faced real adversity. The next day would bring an unexpected ally and a confrontation that would change everything.